Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jason Babel. I am a project manager with Ann Stork Center. And want to thank you all for participating in this very first executive steering committee for the APD Transportation Study. Hopefully, the majority of you are participating via the webinar link that was provided from freeconferencecall.com. That way that you can see the presentation that I'm moving through throughout this process. For those of you who are unable to attend, we were going to make this presentation available to you after the call, and it will be on Ann Stork Center's website. So, for today's agenda, we're going to be giving you an overview of the APD Transportation Study, including the major service goals, the deliverables, the methodologies for achieving these deliverables, as well as our preliminary findings from the assessment of the APD transportation system. And then we're going to be briefly going over the negotiated rate analysis as we're still working through that deliverable. Okay, so the APD Transportation Study Overview. APD has sought out Ann Stork Center and its partners as the APD Transportation Study Team, which includes Tyndall Oliver and Associates and TransferMind, to provide an assessment of their existing transportation services with recommendations for a new transportation business model and functional implementation plan. So the major service goals for this study is to provide an assessment of their current transportation business model, to provide analysis comparing APD's negotiated transportation waiver rates with those rates of the Transportation Disadvantage Coordinated System and Community Transportation Coordinators. They're seeking a recommendation for a formal rate structure process, and ultimately, as I mentioned, to design a new transportation business model to include a functional implementation plan with associated costs, infrastructure, resource allocation, and timeline for implementation. This report will be submitted to the Governor, the President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives on February 1st, 2019. So within the transportation study, there are several deliverables that were included in the contract and were outlined for the APD study team to execute in order to reach this final report. They involve the statement of work and project management plan, the assessment of APD's existing transportation business model, progress report, analysis of the negotiated transportation rates, as well as the new design for the transportation business model, and then the final report, which will be supplied to those legislative bodies that were previously mentioned. So for the Executive Steering Committee, we thought that this would be a great idea to incorporate participatory research and development for this plan. Our intention is to receive feedback from this body of representatives so that we can ensure that our plan is on the right track and that all of the issues that need to be addressed are being addressed, making sure that this will be a plan that will be functional for everyone who participates in APD transportation. So you can see a list of the intended representatives there. And again, we thank you all for participating. So moving through this APD transportation study, we decided that we wanted to use the mobility management model, where we're focusing on the movement of individuals to ensure that we're not looking at one mode of transportation or another, but that those individuals who rely on public transportation, namely APD's support, are being serviced in the most appropriate way. So the inputs that went into this assessment and study so far is, review of APD's policies and procedures to ensure that we are aware of the existing service model. We secured data sets from APD as well as the Commission for Transportation Disadvantage so we could make appropriate analysis. We included national model review for best practice, which ended up being a categorization of the different states and how they provide waiver transportation solutions, and then including best practice from those models that would be appropriate for the model here in Florida. We also conducted literary reviews from state, national, and private transportation agencies to identify best practice and look at the trends in terms of transportation through the waiver process and for individuals who rely on those services. Additionally, we conducted qualitative interviews with different stakeholders Stakeholders that were included in this process are the actual consumers, waiver support coordinators, providers. We included other transportation bodies to ensure that their input was included, and put all of that together as a part of the assessment. Additionally, we are conducting an APD provider survey, which I'll speak a little bit more about. The intention there is to get insights from the providers themselves that may not have been recorded or documented by APD thus far. So the critical issues that we wanted to address per APD's recommendation, and as well as the preliminary findings of our assessment, is looking at management and oversight, safety and liability, rates, and service performance. We felt that that would provide a good assessment of APD's model, and we understand that those are the issues that need to be addressed when we're building the new transportation business model. So at this point, we wanted to just stop very briefly and see if there's any other issues that the Executive Steering Committee believe could be of critical importance while we're providing the assessment and devising the new transportation business model. So for those of you who are on the telephone, you can press *6 on your mobile device to ask a question, and you'll be entered into the queue as we're in question and answer mode. And then those of you who are participating in the webinar, there is a small, looks like dialog box where you can ask a question through that. So I'll give a minute here to see if there's any remarks that the ESC would like to provide with respect to issues of critical importance. Okay, seeing no questions or comments with respect to issues of critical importance, we're going to continue to move on. So as we were moving through the existing transportation model assessment, these were the items that APD wanted included. So essentially, we needed to review and analyze the existing services. They wanted us to conduct an assessment of coordination and management transportation services, safety requirements. They wanted us to look at driver background and safety information, identifying challenges and gaps in services, management and oversight issues, as well as customer needs. And then, of course, include the national models so that we could glean those best practices from those other parties who are engaging in waiver transportation. So the challenges in conducting the assessment are summarized here. We were looking at the data sets that were coming in from APD, and one of the issues that we came across was the available data that was, I guess, gathered from APD while they were moving through their existing transportation service model, and some of those data sets needed to be manipulated in order for us to, I guess, get the appropriate information from there. Another challenge was the national model comparison. Now, Florida has a unique situation in how they provide transportation services to the individuals here, and getting participation from some of the other stakeholders at a national level was a little bit challenging. However, we were able to get a lot of good best practices which are included in the assessment. And then additionally, stakeholder participation. When we were looking at the qualitative interviews from agencies at different levels, this is a new study that's coming out, and there were some challenges in identifying the appropriate stakeholders and getting them to participate in the qualitative interviews. However, we were able to mitigate that situation by getting good lists from APD and reaching out to our existing partners and having them work on our behalf. For example, the Family Care Council, we were able to get several excellent qualitative interviews from individuals who represent the different regions, and we hope the FCC is participating on this executive committee from the regions as well. So if we're looking at the preliminary findings from the assessment, we categorized 3 different areas. And the summary is provided here for those 3 different areas. The first one is service delivery and cost analysis. So based on the existing data that was coming from APD, there was some inconsistencies with transportation costs and reimbursement rates. And it was very difficult to identify the true cost associated with transportation service delivery based on the different rate structures that are in existence at present. So APD has typically 3 different reimbursement rates for transportation providers. One is a mileage rate, one is a per trip rate, and another is a monthly rate. So without any consistency in a common denominator or a service basis, it was very challenging to identify the existing costs for true transportation with the individuals. Another challenge was that some transportation costs are included in ResHab rates. So if you are a group home provider or an APD provider, the quality of life transportation services that you may be providing are included in that rate and not separated. We reached out to several providers to request that they give us an idea on how much they're spending on those quality of life trips, but unfortunately many of the providers that we reached out to didn't have that information. They're not aggregating it, so that cost analysis was unable to be identified while we were moving through here. Additionally, we heard from stakeholders that they are requesting additional funding and flexibility for transportation services. One of the issues that they had was transportation services or reimbursement to those quality of life appointments that individuals are seeking in the community, which relate to APD's long-range plan and goals, including employment. So individuals would like to have jobs at places like Publix, but as it stands right now, that transportation service doesn't exist unless they have an employment coach. So that was one of the issues that we were trying to work through and identify how a new model could start addressing some of those challenges with transportation. Additionally, one of the categories that we looked at was management and oversight as one of the critical components for APD's transportation model. It was identified that the human resources at the state level allocated to transportation are insufficient. As it stands right now, I believe there's 1 individual who's responsible for overseeing transportation within the state office structure, and that person is required to review all the negotiated contracts and create management and oversight. And with somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 providers statewide, that is a difficult task for 1 person. So we're looking at ways to augment the human resources at the state level. Additionally, APD human resources at the regional level are inconsistent. When we were identifying stakeholders at regional levels to participate in the Executive Steering Committee and be liaisons for the regional transportation services, we found that a lot of the titles for people who were identified as the appropriate transportation person were inconsistent, which led us to believe that perhaps their job duties were inconsistent as well, and we were looking at ways to allocate dedicated transportation professionals in each region and again at the state level to make sure that transportation is adequately managed. We also found that there is a need for consistent trip type definitions for proper analysis by the management team. As it stands right now, transportation service delivery is coded in numerous different ways, which makes it difficult for management to analyze and budget and structure for transportation using those different data sets and trip type information. We found that there are opportunities to enhance coordination with other state agencies for reporting purposes, namely safety, which was one of the critical components that APD identified that needs to be addressed in the new business model. We did find that a lot of the transportation service delivery was being purchased through the coordinated system, where agencies are subconsultants or, subcontractors or community transportation coordinators. And they have certain reporting requirements as being a part of the coordinated system. However, some of that information may not be being passed along to APD appropriately, so there's an opportunity to partner there so that APD can oversee some safety requirements or gain access to the information where other providers are reporting to other state agencies. Again, provider reporting is not presently adequate for APD to perform the proper oversight and data analysis. We are looking at ways to enhance the reporting requirements without putting too much burden on the existing transportation providers. We understand that, you know, not all of the providers have the capacity to deal with a lot of compliance and management, so that's one of the ways through the partnership with other state agencies that we can try and create coordination and ensure that the management and oversight practices are being well performed. Additionally, we looked at provider availability and scope of service. So service to life-sustaining activities, as mentioned, is a challenge for APD customers. One of the issues that we came up with when we were looking at provider availability as well as eligibility and enrollment is that transportation providers are not always incentivized to become a part of the transportation service delivery structure. So we're looking at ways to create partnerships and incentivize those providers to become transportation providers, because we did hear from the community that in certain areas there's a lack of provider availability, and what they need to do is, or what we're inviting them to do, is to look at, you know, the current rate structure, of course, to further incentivize providers to become a part of this service delivery model, because we did identify that group homes and ADTs who have more engagement with individuals are often looked at as a higher quality of transportation provider potentially, just because of their knowledge of the individuals and their needs and the multiple service delivery. So here's another question for the Executive Steering Committee. Are there any other issues with APD's existing transportation model that the ESC believes should be addressed within this assessment? I know this is very brief information and these are the themes that we came up with, but I'm inviting you to comment and say if these themes are consistent with your experience, or if you feel that there's other items that could be addressed. And again, if you'd like to make a comment, you can press *6 on your mobile device or use the chat function here, and I'll relay that to the group. The chat function is the little bubble that looks like a dialogue bubble, essentially. So I'll give everyone a minute. Okay, seeing no comments, we're going to continue to move on. In the interest of time, I am going to move forward to the rate negotiated analysis so that my colleague Randall Farwell can participate and kind of walk you through. He is the lead representative for Tyndale Oliver and Associates, and they're working on the negotiated rate deliverable as we speak right now. So I am going to invite Randy to participate now.
Thanks, Jason. This is Randy Farwell. Can you guys hear me? Jason, you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so real quick, what we've been doing is looking at a model in which we can take the distribution of service units provided by APD, which are on a per mile, per trip, and a per month basis, and look at the range of those service units on a urban, for urban trips versus rural trips, and then apply a cost factor that is more consistent with the CTD cost basis to see what happens in terms of operating costs. And the logic here is the CTDs services are more coordinated, and there's a little bit more regulation around them. In addition, what we're doing is we're looking at taking rates that would be not the average, because for both the APD and the CTD, what happens is we have a number of outliers in terms of providers' costs, which pull up the average. So we're looking at taking a doing a cumulative distribution of the service providers, both the rates, both for APD and for CTD, and then identifying a range within about the 50 to 60 percentile, and apply those rates and see what happens in terms of costs for APD relative to the CTD costs. And then further, one of the models we're looking at is doing a per mile based model that also recognizes a loading factor for non-ambulatory riders. So, if you're carrying persons in wheelchairs or scooters, the time it takes to load those people and to disembark them takes much longer than ambulatory customers. So, recognizing the difference there. One of the best practices we've seen has been sort of combining that loading function so that you're getting the providers getting recognition of the additional time it takes, but also not providing an opportunity for the providers to sort of take advantage of a loading, of a full per trip or per mile basis. So we're trying to balance this out a little bit so that we can recognize group trips as well as differently from individual trips, but not cost a group trip the per trip cost, because that doesn't necessarily work out. So those are some of the options we're looking at. There are a couple others, but generally that's what we're doing, and we'll have the analyses done next week, and we'll be able to share that with the group.
Thanks, Randy.
You're welcome, Jason.
So now it's another question for the Executive Steering Committee. Do you guys have feedback on the suggested model for the formal rate structure? I know that rates have been the most pressing issue when I've spoken to waiver support coordinators, individuals, providers. So we're looking for any feedback that you guys may have now on the path that we're taking, the methodology that we're using, and the proposed rate structure. So if you have questions, again, it's *6 on your mobile device, or you can add a question here using the chat feature on the webinar. So I'll give you guys a second here. Okay, seeing no comments, we're going to move on. I'm going to go back just a couple slides here to the assessment next steps. What we're looking at right now, as I mentioned before, is a survey that's being sent out to all of the providers. Essentially, we need to get experiences from each one of them, and APD was a great partner in sending out a survey recently to all of the providers. So far, we've got about 166 responses. We're going to make those results available on our website so that everyone can take a look at them. But the results are still coming in. We have, I believe, until Tuesday of next week for providers to answer that question. But we're asking questions that relate to, their existing transportation business models at the provider level, whether or not they have coordination agreements, what funding sources they have. And the intention here is to really identify what opportunities are currently available based on the provider's individual business models. So in the event that they have coordination agreements, then we know that these agencies are providing safety information to the CTD as well as annual operating reports, and that information could be shared with APD. So we're hoping that this will identify many opportunities for the new business model to enhance coordination and ensure that individuals are being provided with safe and reliable transportation. So the next steps there will be to include this in our final report, and we'll continue to utilize these results as we're doing the rate analysis and other deliverables per the APD study. So I'm going to move forward here to the reporting. This is all the information that we wanted to share at this point. These reports, survey results, all of the documentation that we're putting together will be available on Ann Stork Center's website. That's anstorkcenter.org/APD Transportation Study. You can always email us at apdstudy@anstorkcenter.org if you have information that you believe we should be including in our analysis, or individuals that may be able to provide additional qualitative information. We want this to be truly participatory. So any information that you'd like to share or any information that you need, we'd be happy to discuss that with you. So moving on, that is the last slide. I want to thank you very much for your time. I'm going to open it up now to an open discussion for everyone. So I'm going to end the question and answer portion of this session. I'm going to ask that you guys keep your phones muted if you don't want to participate. But if you do want to participate, if you have a general comment or anything, that would be the appropriate time.
Over.
Okay.
Hi, Jason. This is David Darm. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I was trying to make some questions, but I'm on a landline, and there were some issues with the Q&A. So I don't know if you addressed it because I was having some phone problems, but what were the variables you were considering in your analysis about the data besides the rate? It sounds like you were looking at miles, the cost that would be associated with miles per trip. Are there other variables you're considering to try to get an idea of what the true costs are to deliver transportation services for our population?
Okay, thank you for your question. Tyndall, Oliver and Associates are working through the negotiated rate analysis. I know that when we were looking at it, we were trying to analyze the different data sets that are available, which was somewhat challenging due to the reimbursement model that APD currently has in place. As I mentioned before, they typically reimburse or purchase trips on a per-trip basis, or a mile basis, or a monthly basis. So, for example, if you were looking at the southern region in Miami, there's several providers that would be seeking reimbursement for, say, 96 months of transportation. So when you're looking at that sort of data set, it becomes challenging to identify exactly how many miles or trips that provider has executed over the billing period, because what they're doing is they're seeking reimbursement for an individual on a monthly basis. So we're hoping that this provider survey will provide some additional information that breaks down some of those transportation metrics, so that we can get it down to a basis of a mileage rate. I know we also were looking at issues associated with transportation costs that are included in ResHab rates. What we're hoping is that through the provider survey, as well as looking at the annual operating report for agencies that are in the coordinated system, we can identify how many trips they're actually performing and potentially do away with the monthly rate, because it's the least descriptive when it comes to the transportation business model. And I believe those are the angles that we're looking at it right now. We're trying to analyze APD's rate versus CPD's, and we're trying to find information on how rates are identified. But within the current system right now, there is no formal structure of negotiation. So, we've been looking at providers who have renegotiated the rate. We've been looking at the different regions and how they've determined rates. And historically, the information is inconsistent at that regional level, which is one of the pain points for APD state office when they're looking at trying to identify whether or not they're providing transportation at an efficient rate. So those are the things that we're taking into account right now, and we'll come up with, or I know that we'll come up with a model that is standardized across the region so we can avoid this negotiated process moving forward, and that providers know exactly what they can anticipate for transportation and can better plan as independent providers whether or not transportation is something that's feasible for them. I have one more question here that came in from Diane. Does the model take into consideration the cost of gasoline or cost of living as well as rural versus urban? So that's a great question, and I know that Tyndall, Oliver & Associates right now are gathering all this information. What we're really trying to do is make sure that the rate remains affordable for Agency for Persons with Disabilities, because if we can't come up with something that's consistent and something that is affordable, then it's not going to be implemented. So I know what they're thinking about in terms of the mileage rate is probably the most consistent that we could come up with that takes into account the cost of gasoline. Don't know that we're looking at different cost centers where a gallon of gasoline in Broward County is, say, $3, where in a rural area it's $3.50. But that is a good question and something for us to consider, and I'll make sure that that is included as we're moving through the assessment. Okay, we've got another comment here from Rita. Is there a possibility of rate variation for transportation that is door-to-door as opposed to a central site, parking lots for larger groups? That is a great question as well. I know APD wants to have a structure and formalized rate process. I don't know how many variations of rates we are going to be able to propose in order to keep this system efficient. I know that a majority of the trips that are being provided are within the coordinated system, and that a large number of transportation providers are not solo providers. So this means that they're group homes or they're ADT. So we do believe that the majority of transportation that's being provided right now are to those communal locations, like an adult day training center or a group home. So I think what Randall and the team at TOA are looking at is load-in times for non-ambulatory that will give providers that additional funding, taking into consideration the amount of time it may take to take people to those communal sites, as well as individual one-offs when you're driving people home. So I'll make sure that this question is included as well, and make sure that it's addressed as we're moving through the rate analysis as stakeholder engagement and requests. Is there anything else anyone else would like to add? Any qualitative feedback or ideas that they think we should be including or moving through? Okay, seeing none, I want to thank you again for your participation. The next call is going to be on December 12th. We'll be providing information to you on the negotiated rate, the formal rate structure, I apologize. And we'll be providing information on the APD provider survey, as all of the results should be in. And then the next call will be on January 23rd. We'll be reviewing the new business model and the final report to make sure that everyone believes this is the good solution for APD and individuals served. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attendance. If there's anything else, as always, you can email us or feel free to give us a call. Have a wonderful afternoon.